As we move on to the 1960s, a decade that McClay describes as turbulent, I want to draw your attention to the end of the previous chapter, because I think the key to understanding the moral of the turbulent 60s has to do with what is said here on pages 363 and 364. McClay writes, "In this chapter, we have concentrated on foreign relations in the post-war era, touching on domestic affairs mainly to remark upon the economic recovery and general prosperity of the post-war years. But there was a major development on the domestic scene in the post-war era that we shall reserve for full treatment in the next chapter, but that warrants mentioning in this context. And that is, key line, the emergence of one of the great social movements in American history, the logical successor to abolition, the movement to secure full civil rights for African Americans." As we move to the 1960s, I think it's important to bring back this idea that I've used and employed in many different occasions, and that is thinking of the United States, like any political society, almost like a cave dwelling. What do we do in the cave? What do we see in the cave? But another important question is, who do we see in the cave? Who do we grant dignity to? Who do we see as our equal? This nation, you've heard me say it over and over again, is built upon this great creed that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if that creed is only understood to apply to some and not to others, they might live all around us, but we wouldn't recognize them, nor would we recognize their rights. So a lot of what we're going to talk about in the turbulent 60s has to do with what? It has to do with the question of whether or not, as an entire society, we can enjoy rights as Americans. So what does McClay have to tell us about this? Well, he starts out this chapter on the turbulent 60s by referencing the steady and balanced leadership of Dwight Eisenhower. I mentioned before in a previous lesson the slogan, "I like Ike." Well, why would you like Ike? Well, Ike had led the charge in World War II to defeat the Axis powers. Ike had showed himself, and which is very different than many world leaders at this time, had shown himself as interested in allowing his people and enabling his people to enjoy an excellent economy, to enjoy a peaceful existence with all the worries and threats that were there in the world. In many ways, Ike was somewhat of a boring leader in suggesting this kind of Sears what we call like a Sears Roebuck guide to living, where all you do is you buy, you consume, and then you go on to the next thing. A lot of people thought that, well, maybe there's more to life than that, and we should be living for more. What McClay does here is he suggests that as much as people embraced the "I like Ike" simplicity of the 1950s, they wanted something new and fresh in the 1960s. And this brought on the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960. You had gone from an old president to a young 43-year-old president who encouraged Americans to discover new frontiers. I go back to a previous lesson. We wanted a purpose, we wanted a why, and all of a sudden Kennedy says, there's nothing that we can't do, and Americans respond to that. And they want to do that on a foreign front, by extending capitalism and liberty throughout the world, but they also want to do that on a domestic front, which gives great energy behind the civil rights movement, great energy behind trying to build a society that is true to its principles. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing that happens in the 1960s. A new inspiration to do more, to be better, comes into place. But then, of course, we have to deal with those other things that happened in the 1960s that are referenced in this chapter, right? The tragic assassination of Kennedy, the tragic assassination of Kennedy's brother, tragic assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., who we study in this section. So in this hope for something more, a new frontier, a new life that be brought to all, where we all could enjoy the American dream, we have our society tearing itself apart. We have divisions formed as we try to change and make ourselves better. This is really the spirit of McClay's calling these once balanced American states now turbulent. Where would we go, and would we be able to create a peace again like the 1950s as we were aspiring to do more? That's really the question that I want you to take from this chapter.